Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alan Moss. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. And welcome to our panel discussion on the future of IBD therapy, expert perspectives and biosimilars. I'm going to moderate this session today at the event here in Washington, D.C. during Digestive Diseases Week 2024. We're going to explore the transformative potential of biosimilars in the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease, examining both the vast opportunities and the inherent challenges of incorporating them into practice. We are very grateful for the support of Boehringer Ingelheim, whose commitment to healthcare innovation facilitates advancements in medical therapies and patient care. I'd also like to acknowledge the superb efforts of Avenue Live and Marshall's team, whose expertise in event management have brought us together for this engaging session. Our agenda today includes a deep dive into topics such as the practical implementation of biosimilars, managing transitions in clinical practice, and strategies to navigate insurance processes. So I'd like to welcome our speakers today. We have Melissa Kirkpatrick. She is a clinical pharmacist focused on specialty medication management at the UCSD Health System. Her interests include outpatient management of chronic conditions, and she enjoys providing quality patient care to underserved populations and enabling patients to make an active role in their health care. I'm also joined by Ross Maltz. Ross is an attending pediatric gastroenterologist at Nationwide Children's Hospital, part of the IBD Center, and assistant professor of medicine at Ohio State University College of Medicine. His interests include all aspects of pediatric GI care, with a special interest in inflammatory bowel disease. He's also principal investigator in the Center for Microbial Pathogenesis at the Research Institute at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and he conducts basic science, studying the impact of stressor exposure on inflammation and the microbiome. And then finally, we have Esna Ashari. He is from Atlanta, Georgia, where he lives with his wife and two young sons. He was diagnosed in 2009 with moderate severe Crohn's disease, and he has transitioned to a biosimilar during his treatment course. He is in clinical remission after a year on this biosimilar medication and has remained stable. In the past 18 months, he's been switched to 3 different biosimilars, must be unique in our patient populations, and is here to share his perspectives on biosimilar switches. So thank you all for joining us, and with that, let us get started. So Melissa, I'm going to start with you. Biosimilars are a relatively new perspective in inflammatory bowel disease care. What's the pathway, how they get approved by the FDA, and how does it differ, for example, how they approve other medications?
Of course. First off, thanks for having me. Thanks to all of you for having me. For biosimilars, the process for FDA approval is typically accelerated relative to reference drugs. And that's because the studies are really focused on one thing, sameness. So is this same purity, same potency, same efficacy, really just demonstrating that things are equally safe and equally effective. And so with that process, typically you need to have fewer studies and fewer patients in each study, and that results in less cost to get to market. We don't need studies to determine the correct dose. We already know that. We don't need studies to determine whether or not the compound treats the condition. We already know that. And so with these processes, decreased time to market, decreased size and number of studies results in decreased cost to bring the medication to the market. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, that decreased cost of the medications does not equal decreased efficacy. It's really just decreased cost to bring the product to market. So generics refer to small molecules, and we can make exact copies of those when we are doing the chemical synthesis of the medication. Biologic medications are made by living cells that are engineered to synthesize a particular therapeutic protein of interest. When they do this, they produce the protein, and then sometimes it can get little changes after the fact in something called post-translational modifications. The non-scientific way to think about that is I like to think about a gift in a box. You can buy 100 of the same gift, put them in the same box, and then put a different bow on the top. You have the same gift, but we can't call them identical and exactly the same anymore because you're looking at 100 different things. And biosimilars are that sort of thing. It's not an exact copy, but the active site's the same. It results in the same principal function of that protein. So really very similar, tiny modifications after the fact. And no one needs to worry about the fact that these are not exact copies. That's the case even with reference drugs. There can be tiny changes to the proteins in each dose, in each batch, There's just controls on that variation that we would expect to see. There's also small minor differences in things like stabilizers, buffers. Particularly of interest to patients often is with the adalimumab citrate. That can bring up some feelings for patients. The majority of the biosimilars are formulated to be citrate-free, so there doesn't need to be anxiety around, well, there may be different things and citrate might crop up unexpectedly. It's a really simple process. Because these drugs have been proven to be equally safe, equally effective, there's not a complicated process to switch from one to the other. And as such, there are no guidelines or protocols or anything like that. You would simply substitute one product for another at the time of the patient's next dose.
And I guess along the same lines, do the FDA consider them all in the same way as being interchangeable, or is that a different category?
That's a great question as well. Interchangeable status means that a biosimilar can be substituted for another product without approval from the physician. The manufacturers have to request from the FDA upfront for a product to be interchangeable. So it's a specific designation they have to ask for. And then the studies required to get an interchangeable product are slightly different, but we get reference to biosimilar, switch back to reference, and showing that these drugs, no difference in side effects, no difference in efficacy. And so there are certain biosimilars that are interchangeable, but not all of them are.
So Ross, if I can ask you, in practice, you presumably have many patients who are on biosimilars who switched. What has your been experience at a more practical level with biosimilars?
Yeah, so my clinical experience is really very similar to what's been published in the literature. I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist. We were actually one of the first centers to start using biosimilars in our pediatric population, really based off of the adult literature, which I don't really expect to be any bit different in our pediatric population. And that goes for new starts. So anti-TNF naive patients, whether they're going on the originator or the biosimilar, to me, it doesn't matter because it's going to clinically perform equally. And, if they're on biosimilar A or B or even the originator, whatever the insurance covers, and in order to keep the cost down for the patient, I think that is super important there. And then in regards to switching, switching with patients going from either originator to a biosimilar or even biosimilar to originator or biosimilar to another biosimilar, we clinically have not seen a difference with that. It has not affected their clinical remission or even drug levels, which we monitor very closely. And we even published our data on that in pediatric patients, adolescents, and young adults, actually recently published too in that area. So for me, it really just boils down to what the insurance company will cover from a clinical standpoint, what's going to reduce delays in them getting it, what's going to keep them on their medication, as you just alluded to, and what's going to keep their cost as low as possible.
And when you're having this conversation with parents and with children or patients, what things are reassuring? Is it data? Is it guidelines? What do you find as just your personal experience? What reassures families when you're making either the switch or the start along those lines?
I think it's having that conversation up front and sooner rather than later, I think is super important. And being honest with them, exactly as I just said with them, and how they are very similar products. And, I think this is the right medication for you. They both work very similarly. And I just want you to get on this medication. I prefer you on the medication at the right dose and the right frequency. And whichever one they put you on, it doesn't really matter to me.
Do you see a similar evolution of kind of acceptance of multiple switches in children, or how is that going?
I think how the biologics and biosimilars keep to evolving, I think we're going to have more and more biosimilars on the market, not just for anti-TNF medications that, we commonly use, but I think we're going to be seeing it for other biologics that we've been using, and some are already in the works. From a product standpoint and medication, multiple switches. From a compound standpoint, it should be similar outcomes. I'm more nervous about kind of who's doing all that education of teaching them the different devices and who's getting them set up for copay assistances.
So to Melissa's analogy, you're just testing different bows and wrapping paper and just getting used to the different bows and wrapping paper, right?
Correct.
What's in the box is the same.
Correct.
I think that's a good perspective. So maybe we'll move on to Ash and just get your thoughts. You've been through several experience with biosimilars in your patient journey. You want to share that with us?
It's kind of funny that you mention, they all look different, right? Have different names. They all look different. It can become overwhelming from a patient standpoint, trying to put everything in, knowing what's what, right? When there isn't a single, there's a single classification, but there's multiple subsets of this drug that are doing the same thing, right? And that can be confusing for a patient, especially in my situation. I've switched biologicals 3 times in the last 24 months. I had my last infusion this past Wednesday. They told me, hey, your next order is going to be filled for another biological, a different one, right? That gives me a little bit of anxiety, not because I know what the end result is. I've been on it for 2 years. I'm still in remission, so it's doing its job effectively in my mind. They all have different side effects, though. That's my only thing. Sometimes some of them I'm fatigued for 48 hours to 72 hours, where on some of them I'm only fatigued for 24 hours. Some of them I will have hot and cold flashes for an extended period of time, where on some of them I don't. But overall, my experience with it has been positive because I'm in remission. So I can't say that it's not working for that in that aspect. But there are some differences when it comes to side effects, in my opinion.
And so when you first heard about biosimilars, what were the initial concerns you had, and has that changed over time?
Yeah, initial concerns is that it's something that's similar, right? It's not the same thing you've been on for a decade that's worked, put you in remission. So there is that anxiety. But I have a really good relationship with my GI specialist out of Atlanta Metro, Dr. Weinstein. I've got a great relationship with him, and he educated me on it. And I'm also lucky where my girlfriend, now wife, works for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation when I first, met her. So I've always had a support system right next to me that was on the front lines of being educated, that could educate me. So that helped. And then I think, it just talking to other people in the rooms while you're getting the infusions, it goes a long way. I have seen teenagers book the same 8-week Remicade infusion because I go to the children's center to get my infusions, just so that they can have someone that's going through the same thing with them, right? So it is like, there is different psychological things that you can do through your journey, and friends you can make and support systems that you can put in place to help relieve some of the anxiety of the medicine that might be changing.
So you benefit from having the foundation right there in your home.
Oh yeah, I joke with her that she's the one who gave me Crohn's because we started dating. But no, it's been great because there is support out there. There's different ways to get answers.
So that's a good point, actually. So we're going to circle back actually to Melissa and think about, so from a patient perspective, we discussed reassuring physicians. What are the tools you found helpful with educating patients, and what do you think they find them receptive to?
Exactly. As Ash mentioned, talking about this with the patients ahead of time and building a trust with your provider is huge. And so we always try to make sure that we're the one addressing the biosimilar change. The trust is not always there with a patient and their insurer. And so I don't like it when my patients hear it first from the insurer. So we try to be proactive. We do a lot of MyChart messaging. We try to do education during visits and give them resources like from the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation and others so that they can do further research on their own, taking power over this and getting familiar and comfortable with it so that, again, when it comes time to switch, it's understandable there's going to be anxiety being asked to make any sort of change, but knowing that we have confidence in the fact that this will continue to treat you well and make you well, just really trying to be proactive about that.
And how about you, Ross? What have you found as a helpful tip? I mean, apart from the trust they have in you, what else do you use as a backup for that?
Yeah, being proactive with your education is super important. So any patient starting on an anti-TNF medication, I'm having the conversation right at the start. Any patient that's on an anti-TNF originator, I'm having the conversation about biosimilars because there's a very high chance that they're going to be on either a biosimilar for anti-TNF or a biosimilar for another biologic, in the coming weeks, months, years down the road. And I want me to be the one kind of giving that proactive education because I've been seeing them for months or years at a time. Because I don't want the letter to come in the mail from the insurance company. And I've seen many of them from my patients because they take a MyChart message and then they send them in. And they all sound very similar. They all say your medication you're not on is no longer covered and you need to switch. And it's a really vague letter, in my opinion, with very little to no education in there about biosimilars. It talks about that they should switch to the biosimilar, but sometimes actually mentions other biologic medications with different mechanisms. So completely confuses me, but also confuses the patients. And if they haven't had that kind of education about biosimilars, it's really instant panic sets in. A medicine that I've been on for many years that I now need to change, what's going to happen? You get all the what ifs questions. What's going to happen to me? What's going to, am I going to get out of remission? And am I going to have different side effects? So, if you had that conversation and you provided that education, that really helps reduce the anxiety with switching.
What do you think is the most common misconception out there about biosimilars, either amongst your colleagues or with the patients?
I think some of the misconceptions really has to do amongst some of the providers and patients is lack of education around it. We actually did a study a couple years ago. It was a survey study of pediatric patients with inflammatory bowel disease on the originator and their parents. And unfortunately, in that survey, the parents that had heard of biosimilars had negative impressions of biosimilars. So I think they had a large misconception of it. And that population, if they go into with a negative misconception, if they have to go through a switch, I'm nervous that they're going to develop a nocebo effect to it.
So maybe that's a good point, the nocebo effect. Maybe explain that a bit because not everyone's heard of it.
So a lot of people are familiar with the placebo effect, where the nocebo effect is that if you're changing to a different medication and have negative expectations or negative thoughts or concern that you're going to have side effects or it's not going to work as well, then you're more likely to develop a nocebo effect. So you're more likely to develop those side effects or medicine not work as well for you. There are ways to combat the nocebo effect, and it all circles back to education. And, explaining it and explaining biosimilars in a truthful, positive way, and how we explain it and how we use our word choices, which, I really think about for when I'm talking about biosimilars, but when I'm talking about everything with patients.
I do want to add one thing. I think it's important that if you don't have the right doctor, you find another one. If you're not comfortable with it, because I actually have probably went through about maybe 3 or 4 different GIs until I found the one that was right for me, that I could have the right conversation with, that I felt comfortable with, and I felt had the right plan for me and was looking out for me. So I think that's just as important, that if a patient is not comfortable or feels like they are not being, heard from their GI or their doctor, there are other professionals out there and they should seek that out.
They're all here in DC this weekend. So Ross, I'm going to come to you. So from a practical perspective, what things could a practice do to really help this transition beyond just accepting the theory of it?
So from a practice standpoint, when I'm starting a patient on an infliximab or adalimumab product on outpatient setting, I have to get a prior authorization. I'm blessed and very lucky that I work with a specialty pharmacist that is amazing, who helps guide me and tries to keep an idea of what the insurance formularies require and which product they prefer. So I'm able to prescribe that one, but it's very hard to keep up with the constant changes in the formularies and such. So sometimes we prescribe biosimilar A and it gets denied, and then they want biosimilar B for that product. And, there's a little bit of delay because then we have to kind of resubmit for everything. And then hopefully it goes through very smoothly and such. But I think really on a practical standpoint, the biggest thing is on the inpatient side. So on the inpatient side, when I'm seeing patients, actually, I can give them the medication without prior authorization. I can start treating them and not wait for prior authorization. It's when you transition from the inpatient to the outpatient side. and you've already started a medication. They all have induction dosing. The next dose is due at a specific time point. So now if the clock is ticking at this point for me to get a prior authorization so that I can continue the induction dosing. And I think it's really important that I'm picking the correct medication at that point when I'm starting it inpatient. What I mean by that, medication-wise, so if I'm starting infliximab, that I'm picking the correct one that's on the insurance's formulary. And regardless of it's the originator or biosimilar A, B, and C. So that when we are transitioning into outpatient, I'm getting the appropriate kind of PA in place, prior authorization in place, and that there's no delays during induction dosing. And that I'm actually, there's no delays and I'm not switching a patient right off the bat and such.
And how do you convince the institution or the practice to put the money into having that specialty pharmacist or having that pharm tech to help you? What's the argument there that you can make?
So I think it's a couple fold for the specialty pharmacist. It improves patient outcomes. It clearly improves patient outcomes. It gives you another team member that's really educated in this that can do as much as I'm able to do in educating patients. They can do injection teachings, and then they can also help, arrange for filling of the medication and even sometimes help with filling it through, our specialty pharmacy too.
We've had biosimilars now for several years. What kind of safety studies are done, and how do we feel reassured over time that the safety remains as good as the originator?
Exactly. So the FDA requires post-marketing analysis of all and reports of safety, efficacy for all medications. These reports have to be submitted from the manufacturers regularly after a drug enters the market. And then oftentimes there are post-marketing studies that are conducted, and that's really a win-win for everybody. I think the post-marketing studies help to increase provider and patient confidence in a product because we're gathering data from the real world. But it also is generally less expensive to conduct than a preclinical trial. And then it's not delaying the product getting to market. So that's always good for access and for manufacturers. So, these post-marketing studies give us a lot of real-world data, and we're coming up on close to a decade of data. And, large systematic reviews have been done that say with these biosimilar medications, there is no decrease in efficacy. There is no increased adverse effects. And really, it's equivalent across the board. So I think it is nice that we have that long-term data. When we're looking at that, though, there's some roles that providers and individual practices can play. And, we need to think about not just safety of the drug and efficacy of the drug, but things that can change those components. Storage, transportation, because temperature is important. And we want to make sure those things are kept constant because that can affect efficacy. To your point, there's lots of different injectors. And so I think one thing on an individual level is that when there's a misfire or a problem with an injector, that gets reported to the manufacturer. A, because oftentimes the manufacturers will replace that dose that misfired. But B, then it gives them the data to say this is the number of misfires that we've had and helps them to collect that data. Because we're not going to be able to submit accurate reports to the regulatory bodies unless we have the data.
So Ashley, I'm going to come back to you.
Okay.
We talked a little bit about trust and the team and have these multiple switches. Has that made you more informed of your care? How has it changed your relationship with your
Yeah, it's made me more informed of my care. And what I've actually also done is I talked to my GI about, hey, do you have a primary care that you recommend that you work hand in hand with? And I made that switch probably about 3 years ago. So now I've got, my GI and my primary care who are on the same page. And that right there is so helpful to have your doctors on the same page when it comes to that, because, it could be that it's a simple, you need a B12 shot or something like that. And your primary care can help you with that based on the blood works and whatever they're doing. So, so that's one thing that I've done. And then just, you just try to educate yourself. The thing that I try to do now is find out what biosimilar I'm going to go on next, and then do a little bit of reading on it. But like I've said before, they're all the same in the end to me as a patient, and they do their job.
Actually, Ross brought an interesting point there about telling everyone up front, no matter what they're starting, we're going to start you on X, but over time you may go to Y and Z. Do you think that kind of pre-informed decision-making would help?
Yeah, I do. I actually do, because you don't get comfortable with your medication and then someone comes and says, here's a different one, when you're starting to get comfortable. But if you have that, I think if that discussion is taking place at the beginning, and it's, hey, there are multiple different biosimilars, they all act the same, based on insurance, based on cost, whatever makes sense in your life or formula, whatever you have, we might have to change it. But it's still going to do the same thing. I think that goes a long way then to all of a sudden, because sometimes what could end up happening, and I've seen this happen before, is I've seen while I'm getting an infusion, someone say, hey, you're going to go on XYZ biosimilar next time, and they didn't even hear from their doctor yet. And that, that's not a great feeling. I feel sorry for that person, because you're blindsided at that point, and then, you're not feeling as comfortable with the medication that's been working for you.
Good point. And so I'm going to ask this to all of you and get your perspective on this. So, even if we have willing patients and willing providers and willing pharmacists, it's clear so far in the US that the barrier really is on the payer side and how they handle biosimilars. So what strategies have you found helpful to address this, where it's sometimes beyond your control, but at least you can try and preempt, try and overcome some of these hurdles? So I'll start with you, Melissa.
Again, we've all talked about education. I think historically we've used the brand names of medications in our visits with patients because it's easier to say, frankly.
Sure.
But I think it's time for a little bit of a shift where we say, you're going to go on infliximab, and there are these different versions of it, or you're going to go on adalimumab, and there are these different versions of it. So again, patients are not feeling like they're getting switched, a bait and switch, basically, or hearing a strange name when they're about to receive a medication. And I try to tell my patients, the worst thing you can do is delay your dose or go off therapy because you're waiting for us to fight with the insurance about the one specific version of this that you want. I am fine with any of these medications. The one the insurance covers is equally effective. It's really just about staying on medication.
Because sometimes it's the flavor of the month.
Exactly. It's this, and then I'll call you 6 months from now and say, actually, we're going to go back on this other one. So it's really just what can keep you on medication.
So when we think about looking forward now, we've had now, as Melissa mentioned, 10 years of experience of comfort of data from US and Europe. What's most exciting you about the next phase of biosimilars in terms of using them in practice, opportunities for patients that you think is going to happen over the next couple of years?
I am most excited about different classes of biosimilars coming to market because as of right now in the United States, our only biosimilar options are anti-TNFs. And a lot of times insurers or payers will have these criteria that you have to meet. They'll have their first line thing that says, this is what we'll pay for, and we won't pay for anything else until you failed this first thing. And so if the biosimilars are more cost effective for them, they're going to propose that as their first line. For our patients, anti-TNFs are not always the first right answer. And so I'm excited that hopefully as we have more biosimilars, we'll have more of those payer-supported first-line options, and I can access different therapies for my patients a little more easily.
So making access, so not so much stepping through stuff, just straight in if you need first line. Yeah, good point. How about you? What are you excited about? Things that may open opportunities for patients going forward?
So to me, biosimilars create competition. Competition on the market. Competition is going to drive down costs for patients, drive down costs for the federal government, for state governments, for health insurance, but really most importantly, patients. So access is very, very important. And we've seen that as biosimilars have hit the market, the cost of the biosimilars and the cost of the originator medications have decreased significantly. So with the decreased costs, hopefully that also changes health insurance's formularies. Maybe it's easier to get patients on that biologic medication that is the most indicated, and they don't have to jump through hoops and go through delays and have to go through step therapy and stuff like that. So that is what I'm most excited about, in addition to having more competition for other biologic medications, as you alluded to. But I hope it happens sooner. I hope we don't have to wait 2 decades after infliximab originator, or 2+ decades after, 2 decades after infliximab originator was on the market.
Yeah, that reminds me, a colleague told me in some parts of Europe, biosimilars are as cheap as mesalamine, right? Imagine how that would do in terms of first choice options, or giving you different first choice options. And I'm sure actually, Ash, for you, over the course of your disease, you've seen huge fluctuations in what the end point to you is in terms of costs. And I think we're going to wrap up now. Any final thoughts, Melissa, going forward, tips for patients or providers here that say this is what makes it most effective in practice for using biosimilars?
Yeah, I think one thing I just haven't been able to address, and Ash has done a good job of it, is the use of copay cards. To my knowledge, all of the biosimilar available products have patient support systems, whether that's copay cards, patient assistance. So there should never be my insurance required me to switch and now I have this huge bill. So that should never be the case. And if patients are seeing that, they need to get in contact with their providers because the financial burden should not be something that needs to be considered here.
Great. Any take-home message from you, Ross?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be afraid of going on a biosimilar. I think providers need to be well educated. So hopefully they're looking at all the resources that is out there and all the education and the scientific data there. But biosimilars are really improving our ability to take care of patients with IBD.
I'm going to give the last thought from the panel to the patient.
No, I would say as a patient, make sure you've got your right doctor team. That's first and foremost, because if you don't have the right doctors, you're just going to struggle if you don't have that support. And then biosimilars, they've worked for me. I'm in remission. I've been in remission for 12 plus years now, and I hope everybody can be in remission at some point if you're struggling. So you're here.
Do you guys keep a tally of who has what, or how do you help patients approach that and knowing, is this part of what's on offer for me?
Yes. So I think it's good to know that everyone does have a patient assistance program. You're right. Some are just easier than others. And I think that's where, again, all of my biosimilars are equally safe, equally effective, but I have a couple that I tend to prescribe more than others, and it tends to be because of access pieces on my end. So how easy is that to access? But in addition, one other interesting thing about the biosimilars and kind of driving down cost is it's nice to have patient assistance programs. It's nice to have copay cards for commercially insured patients, but there's sometimes where there are certain patients where that doesn't serve. So with the availability of biosimilars and the fact that they cost less, we now have sort of extra insurance options. So we can do things like use GoodRx coupons, which are typically only available for generic medications. We can use Mark Cuban's cost plus drug pharmacy, which again is a direct sort of eliminates middlemen to reduce competition, but only carries generics. So the availability of the biosimilars, those are also some ways that we can get medications at a cheaper cost for patients when these typical insurance, patient assistance program, copay cards, insurance-driven programs aren't always available.
That's something, Rob?
Yeah, so we keep track of the financial support that each drug company has and kind of where the patients can go. Actually, I have an educational website that I built regarding to biosimilars, so I'll give a little plug for it. I hope it's okay.
You can throw the name if you want.
So osu.edu/biosimilars. And we actually have a table on there listing all of the financial support for each of the adalimumab biosimilars to kind of see what are the subtle differences, or at least a link to go to and go look at it. But it is challenging to keep it up to date because they're going to constantly be changing.
That's great. That's great. Cool.
Mm-hmm. I'll be using that.
Yeah. Cool. So I'd like to thank all the panel for joining me today and all of you for joining us on this presentation, The Future of IBD Therapy, Expert Perspectives on Biosimilars. If you want more information, either go to the Crohn's & Colitis Foundation website. There's lots of information there on biosimilars. Ross has a plug for his website also. I'd like to thank Boehringer Ingelheim for supporting this program and for Avenue Live and Marshall's team for their production efforts. And we hope this is helpful, and we look forward to seeing you all again during DDW this week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.